Drive more than 4 hours northeast of San Francisco, past Sacramento, and up into the Sierra Nevada, and you reach a tiny mountain town called Keddie. You'd miss it if you blinked. A handful of houses tucked between tall pines. The air smells like dirt and needles. It's quiet. Almost too quiet. In 1981, Keddie was an old resort that had been turned into cheap housing, a cluster of cabins beside a railroad line. People didn't lock their doors. Neighbors knew each other's business, or thought they did. On the morning of April 12, 1981, that quiet broke. What happened inside Cabin 28 is still one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in California. A botched investigation. Quiet talk of a cover-up. Two suspects were never charged and a confession that led nowhere. And a 12-year-old girl who vanished from the house that night and wasn't found for 3 years. This is the story of the Keddie Cabin Murders. The Sharp family had only just arrived. Glenna Sharp, who everyone called Sue, was a 36-year-old single mother. In 1979, she left her husband back in Connecticut and moved her 5 children to Northern California, where her brother lived. She wanted a fresh start. By the spring of 1981, she'd been in Keddie about 7 months, renting house number 28. There's a small strange detail here that matters later. The cabin had come free because the area's farmer chef, Doc Thomas, had moved out of it. The same Doc Thomas who would soon be running the investigation into what happened there. On the night of Saturday, April 11th, the house was full. Sue was home. So was her 15-year-old son John with his 17-year-old friend Dana Wingate. Her 12-year-old daughter Tina was there too. And in a back bedroom were the 2 youngest boys, 10-year-old Rick and 5-year-old Greg, along with the neighbor's son, 12-year-old Justin Smartt, who was sleeping over. One child wasn't at home. Sue's 14-year-old daughter, Sheila, was spending the night next door with the Siebel family in cabin 27. That is the only reason she's alive. We can piece the evening together. Sheila left for the Siebels a little after 8. Around 9, neighbors noticed an unfamiliar green van parked outside the Sharps' house, a van that was never identified. Around 9:30, Tina walked home from watching TV next door. And at about 1:15 in the morning, a couple in a nearby cabin woke to that sounded like muffled screaming. Then it stopped. The next morning looked ordinary from the outside. Around 10, Sheila walked back over to cabin 28. What she found there stayed with her for the rest of her life. 3 people were dead in the living room: her mother Sue, her brother John, and Dana Wingate. All 3 had been bound with electrical cords and medical tape. Blood spatter analysis would later show the whole attack happened in that one room. I'll keep the medical detail restrained, out of respect for the family, but it matters to the case. Sue had been stabbed and her throat cut, and there was an impression on her head left by the butt of a Daisy pellet rifle, not a hammer. John's throat had been slashed and he had blunt force injuries to the head. Dana had had injuries too, and he'd been strangled. He died of asphyxiation. Investigators found 2 bloodied knives and a hammer at the scene. A second bloody knife turned up later in a trash bin behind the Keddie General Store. Here's the part that's hardest to sit with. The 3 younger boys, Rick, Greg, and Justin, were in a bedroom in the same house. Not next door, the same house, and none of them were touched. A massacre happened a few rooms away and the children slept through it and survived. Why would someone kill 3 people and leave 3 children alive? Keep that in mind, we'll come back to it, because it matters more than it looks. And then there was Tina, 12 years old. She wasn't among the bodies. She wasn't in the bedroom with the boys. Tina Sharp was just gone. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department arrived, and almost at once things started going wrong. The scene was never properly secured. A neighbor, Jamie Siebold, had already pulled the three boys out through a bedroom window and then went back in through the rear door to look for survivors, possibly tracking through evidence as he did. It got worse from there. Then there was Justin, the 12-year-old who'd slept over. At first, he said he slept through the whole thing. Later, he said he dreamed parts of it. And eventually, under hypnosis, he described seeing two men in the house with Sue, an argument that turned violent when John and Dana came in, and a child being led out of the back door. This is where I have to slow down, because how that account was produced changes how much weight it can carry. Memory isn't a recording. Under hypnosis, people don't replay hidden footage. They get more suggestible and more confident, and they start blending real fragments with things that were never there. Courts have known this for decades, which is why hypnotically refreshed testimony is restricted in so many of them. A psychologist at the time thought Justin had probably seen something real and recast it as a dream to cope, which is a recognized way children handle trauma. That's believable. It also means the sketches drawn from that session, and they were drawn by a local amateur with no forensic training, rest on very thin ice. They might point at something real. They might point at nothing. So the case already had a contaminant scene, a child witness whose memory couldn't be taken as fact, and sketches nobody could verify. Then it got worse, because the strongest leads pointed at a man living 2 cabins away. His name was Martin Smartt, Marty. He was Justin's stepfather, married to a woman named Marilyn, and he lived in the same little cluster of cabins. The families knew each other, at least on the surface. Staying with the Smartt at the time was a friend of Marty's, John Boubede, who went by Bo. Boubede told people he was a former Chicago police officer and that Marilyn was his niece. Neither was true. He was also rumored to have organized crime connections in Chicago. What's actually documented is plainer. He was an outsider who turned up in this tiny town not long before 4 people were attacked in it. Here's the first thing that should have made Smartt a serious suspect. When investigators talked to him, he told them a claw hammer had gone missing from his home, right around the time a hammer was used in the killings. Then there's the letter. After the murders, Smartt left for Reno and wrote to his wife about the ruin of their marriage. In it he wrote that he had bought it with 4 people's lives. 4 people. 3 died in that living room. 4 died in this case. Years later, the lead cold case investigator said the letter had been overlooked at the time and never entered into evidence. There's more. A counselor, Smartt saw, reportedly at a veterans facility in Reno, later said Smartt had confessed to killing Sue and Tina. By that account, Smartt insisted he had nothing to do with the boys, and said Tina was killed because she'd seen everything and could identify him. When it reached the State Department of Justice in 1981, it was reportedly written off as heresy. Marilyn left Marty the day after the murders and took Justin with her. Years later, in a 2008 documentary, she said plainly that she believed her husband and Boubede did it. Her own account of that night shifted over the years. At one point she said the 2 men had gone out to the resort bar and had wanted Sue to come along. I want to be careful here. Both men are dead. Boubede died in 1988, Smartt in 2000. Neither was ever arrested or charged with anything connected to Keddie. They are suspects, not convicted killers, and that line matters legally and morally. Now back to that question. Why were the 3 boys left alive? Sparing children says something. A stranger who breaks in to kill a house full of people doesn't usually leave 3 witnesses asleep down the hall. sparing them, especially when one of them was the stepson of a prime suspect, points to someone with a personal tie to that household. Someone for whom those particular kids were off limits. Look at the violence too. The attack on John and Dana reads as personal and explosive close-up and full of rage. Tina's removal reads as something colder and more deliberate, the silencing of a witness. That's two different kinds of killing in one night, and two motives can mean two people, which fits the old theory that there were two attackers, not one. One more thread. If the letter and the confession are real, they don't sound like a cold, indifferent predator. They sound like a man being eaten alive by what he did, half confessing to a wife and a counselor, unable to keep it down. That's a different picture than the calculating psychopath these stories usually reach for. Maybe a more human one and a sadder one. But this is interpretation, not proof. For 3 years nobody knew what happened to Tina. The FBI first treated it as a possible abduction, then stepped back and left it to the state. Then, on April 11, 1984, almost exactly 3 years after the murders, a man out collecting bottles found part of a human skull and jawbone at a spot called Camp 18 in Butte County, about 60 miles from Keddie. That summer, a forensic pathologist confirmed the remains were Tina's, and here's the part that still gets under your skin. Soon after the discovery was made public, someone called the Butte County Sheriff's Office anonymously and told them the remains were Tina's, naming her, when the public had no way of knowing that. The call wasn't documented at the time. The recording of it turned up years later at the bottom of an evidence box, sometime after 2013. Someone knew, someone called, and the lead sat there for decades. So, the investigation, or the failure of it. The scene was contaminated early. The sketches came from an untrained amateur. Smart's letter was overlooked and never logged as evidence. The alleged confession got waved off as hearsay, and the sheriff in charge, Doug Thomas, the same man who'd lived in Cabin 28 before the Sharps, was reportedly friendly with Smartt and later said Smartt had passed a polygraph. Was it a cover-up? Or just a small county in over its head against a crime it had no business handling? I don't know, and I won't pretend to. The current sheriff has admitted the cover-up question keeps coming back, while pushing people to focus on solving it instead. Here's how I'd put it. You don't need a conspiracy to lose a case this badly. But the failures were real, and they cost the Sharp family their answers. Cabin 28 was torn down in 2004. The land where it stood is bare dirt now. The case didn't die though. In 2016, a hammer was pulled from a pond near the old cabin site, matching the one Smartt said he'd lost. The sheriff said it looked deliberately placed, not dropped by accident. Around the same time, investigators said they were looking at 6 possible suspects. Then in 2018, the cold case investigator said something that stuck with me. DNA taken from a piece of tape at the scene matched a known suspect who is still alive. Investigators have said they think there are people still living who were accessories after the fact. People in that community who've kept quiet for 40 years. And still no one has been charged. No conviction, no closure. The Keddie murders are a wound that never closed. For Sheila Sharp, who walked into that cabin at 14, and has spent her life pushing for answers, it never could. So let it end with them. A single mother trying to build a new life in the mountains. Her 15-year-old son. His 17-year-old friend who'd just come over to hang out. And a 12-year-old girl taken from her own home, lost for 3 years before she could ever be buried. There are people alive right now who know what happened in Cabin 28. A letter was written. A confession was reportedly made. DNA has been matched. The pieces are sitting there. What's missing is one person willing to say what they know. If that's you, it's not too late. Thanks a lot for watching. Cases like these are hard, not for the violence so much as for the silence that came after. If this was worth your time, subscribe and help keep these names from fading out. I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there.